Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. For this installment, we're tackling a most excellent commander. Atla Palani Nest Tender is among the top 3 most popular commanders from the 2019 Precon set. A 2/3 Naya Shaman, she creates egg tokens that hatch into enormous monsters, an ability reminiscent of the old classic Mael the Anima. With every set, Atla Palani discovers more and more amazing beasties to add to her deck, ready to cheat straight into play and wreak tons of havoc. Atla Palani's EDHREC page shows us she's definitely kept up with the times. She's found clever ways to create extra eggs, some sacrifice outlets to crack the eggs open at will, and not to mention some classic Naya spells that help ramp into those big monsters so we can hardcast them in the late game. Her most interesting section, though, is definitely her creatures section, where we see some absolutely bangin' baddies. No more waiting though, let's get a list from the average deck feature and import it to the Architect deck building website. Remember that, as always, any swaps we make must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. Cue the Godzilla music, these are some truly titanic terrors. Some of these cards also cost a pretty penny, but when it comes to cheating out huge 12 power creatures, even something that costs a quarter will squash our enemies all the same, so stick around for budget-friendly honorable mentions at the end of the video. I also should note here, I see a high number of 2-mana ramp effects, which help us run out Atla Palani on turn 3, to make sure that she can start creating eggs as soon as possible. When you're cheating things into play, time is absolutely of the essence, so that we can get trampling before our enemies set up their defenses. Let's also spend just a little time getting to know some key spells in this deck. Congregation at Dawn can set up the top of our library, giving us exactly the creatures we want when our eggs start to hatch. Skull Clamp helps us crack our eggs and draw cards, which just seems like really silly good synergy. And since Atla Palani is a shaman, holy dang, Thornbite Staff is incredible, giving us the ability to untap our commander to create a new egg right after another one just died. Combined with a sacrifice outlet like Ashnod's Altar, this gets infinitely absurd. Speaking of eggs, our commander isn't the only way that we can make those delicious tokens. Nesting Dragon creates egg tokens too, which Atla Palani's ability will take advantage of. Populate effects can copy the eggs we already have as well, and Seedborn Muse can untap our commander to let her create multiple eggs per round. However, my favorite is definitely Mirror Entity, a changeling that counts as an egg and can turn all of our creatures into eggs too. This also goes for Maskwood Nexus, a truly crazy artifact. In the event of a board wipe, all our creatures are eggs, triggering Atla Palani on the way out and resupplying the board with a new batch of baddies. That's some A+ resiliency right there. As for the actual creatures we're cheating into play, classics like Gisela and Avacyn put in tons of work, and the new dragon Old Gnawbone has already made his home amongst these other monstrosities. I know this isn't really the time or the place, but if you'd have told me years ago that one day a green would have a mythic flying creature that makes artifact tokens, I'd have said you were nuts. As it is, it's this thing that's nuts, making it downright easy to hardcast the other huge creatures in our hand. Oh, and by the way, do you know what happens when Avacyn joins forces with an Apex Altasaur? The Altasaur gets to fight every other creature forever, completely demolishing the rest of the board. Sick beats. Other great favorites include cards like Terror of the Peaks, Worldspine Worm, which is really good synergy right there, holy crap, 15 damage, and the eternally printed in Precon Zetalpa, which also puts in a ton of work here. Any one of these creatures on the battlefield might make the rest of the table pretty scared, but Atla is really good at getting a bunch of them into play at once. So, now that we know the deck a little bit better, let's get cracking. I like my eggy upgrades in the following 3 ways. Scrambled, over easy, and sunny side up. Let's start off with a nice scramble. We're basically starting off with a mishmash grab bag here. These are all peripheral to Atla Palani's core strategy, but these slight tweaks and improvements to the utility will help support the deck and make sure that our plan can actually work out in the first place. The very first card that draws my focus is Domri, Anarch of Bolas. He feels very out of place here. Conditional counterspell prevention isn't great on a killable 3-mana planeswalker, and his best utility tends to be that he helps us destroy an egg by making it fight another creature. We have much better ways of doing that, so let's make like Nicol Bolas and pitch Domri aside to free up a card slot. Domri was the first card that caught my eye, but the next card I want to discuss is one I almost overlooked, Growing Ranks. I initially kind of took this one for granted. Cool, Populate is nice to make more egg tokens, it seems right at home. But when playtesting, man, did this card fail to perform. Eggs are just about our only token, and the upcreep trigger was very slow, totally leaving open windows of opportunity for enemies to remove Atla before any benefit could be gained. The other incidental populate spells are great because they have an extra use that we don't feel bad utilizing even without other eggs in play. But when this card's only function is to make more eggs, and it requires a pretty heavy time investment before any payoff can be had, and it does nothing if things go even slightly wrong, yeah, I'm just kinda off it. The final card I'll be cutting in this section is one that I just have absolutely no love for. Colossal Majesty is a colossal disappointment. Nothing majestic about it at all. Again, the upkeep trigger is just awkward and slow, and when we're behind, this card does diddly squat. Conditional card draw and only once per turn. Green is practically the #1 color for card draw these days. We can and will do better than this. So let's do better than this. One of the cards I'm absolutely most keen on including to this deck right now is Rishkar's Expertise. After the reprint in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms Commander decks, this card's about $2. Get it before it goes back up. This card is a staple in Commander, and this deck contains dozens of creatures with 8 or more power. If we're gonna play a card that requires us to have a creature in play to draw a bunch of cards, let's do it right. Then we have the ultimate Scrambly card. The deck already contains protective spells like Heroic Intervention and Boros Charm and Rootborn defenses to help us keep our big board alive. There's one other card I want to suggest adding to this lineup too, though, and that's the card Tybalt's Trickery. We do not like board wipes. We need every bit of protection against them that we can possibly find. And while some of the big protection spells out there are very, very pricey, Tybalt's Trickery is playfully affordable. I've watched Tybalt's Trickery save someone's bacon so many times that it frankly feels silly, and I think we'd benefit here from the added and unexpected protection that it provides. That does it for section 1, so now it's time for our second round. It's called over easy, but this will not be over quickly. Here I want to talk about the cards that help us flip those crazy cool creatures off the top of our deck. Alright, deep breath. Let's talk about some of the eggs that are already in this deck. Rock Egg, Dragon Egg, and Irregular Cohort are all egg creatures. That's pretty dang cool. Atla Palani has a limit to the eggs that she can make every turn, so additional eggs like these help supplement that output. At least, in theory. I don't know how else to say it, but in my experience, these cards have just not performed well, and the reason is because they're also creatures that our egg tokens can flip into when they hatch. Cracking an egg, hoping for a big baddie, and instead winding up with a 0/2 is a pretty rough feeling. If you have a free sacrifice outlet in play, this problem can be mitigated. Just sacrifice the new egg and get digging all over again. I expect a solid number of Atla Palani players will make the case that this isn't really a problem, and I think that's totally fair. I'm speaking here from my own playtesting experience and my own experience playing against Atla Palani in the past. And in those experiences, these eggs have behaved like speed bumps, since we don't always have a free sacrifice outlet in play. And it's not all that uncommon for the egg cracking to officially occur with some sort of a board wipe. And when the dust settles after a board wipe, it feels pretty bad to have wound up with a 0/2 instead of with like a 15/15. All in all, I personally have found that the deck is okay without these, so that we can guarantee more reliably to flip into enormous creatures every single time. As with Polymorph and Cascade themed decks, it's okay to slim down on our flippable targets, because it makes it that much more potent when those new creatures begin to emerge. I want to be sure to draw the line here about Mirror Entity though. Mirror Entity is absolutely staying in the deck because it does not feel bad to flip into. It's pump, it's a sacrifice outlet technically, and it's an absolute bomb in this deck, turning all our creatures into eggs when we need it. Oh, and speaking of which, I should probably mention what it is that I'll be replacing these eggs and changelings with. If you've been a longtime listener of the EDHREC podcast, you may already know what's coming. The Velas Vel sister spells are a delight. You become an egg, and you become an egg. What better way to protect our investment than with a pretty literal nest egg? In response to a board wipe that would kill off the creatures we've worked so hard to nurture, we can turn them into eggs just like with Mirror Entity, so that we'll once again flip into a new board. These even work on Atla Palani herself, which is just the cherry on top. There's a whole other category of cards I'm itching to add in too, but before we move on, it turns out I'm not actually done yet with the potential duds, quote unquote, that we might flip off the top of our deck. The new card Harmonic Prodigy is an absolute banger in a lot of decks led by wizards and shamans, and since Atla Palani is herself a shaman, I'm not at all surprised to see that it's crept into her data. Whenever an egg dies, she'd get 2 bites at the apple. But you guessed it, just like the Rock Egg and friends, this has become, for me, one of those cards that works in theory, but fumbles IRL. Flipping into this guy was consistently more parts frustrating than exciting. And when Atla Palani is already a really high-profile target for enemy removal spells, this card just felt a hair too commander-centric to help like I wanted it to. I think this could easily end up being one of those your mileage may vary type of cards. And again, it's bonkers good for a ton of other wizard and shaman commanders out there. But just make sure you evaluate this one with a properly critical eye, because it's got a serious downside here that isn't immediately obvious. We're not quite done with section 2 yet though. There's one thing I found this deck is in dire need of. Looking at the list, we only have count them, two at-will free sacrifice outlets. I do not believe this to be enough, not by a long shot. When we make an egg, we want to be in control of just how long it needs to incubate. We need more sacrifice outlets here, so I am happy to recommend two personal favorites. Fanatical Devotion is absolutely splendid. Sacrifice an egg at will, and we can also happen to regenerate our commander in case she would be dying. A+. And Martyr's Cause is sneaky awesome too. It's been errated slightly just to clean up the language, but basically it allows us to sacrifice a creature whenever we want to incidentally prevent the next damage that some source of our choice would deal this turn. Not only can we threaten to flip a huge dragon or angel into play out of nowhere, but we can also just completely blank our opponent's best attacker while we do it. I'm also decently confident that since this effect doesn't say it targets the source of damage, it therefore gets around protection, which is pretty dang potent. We're not done adding sacrifice outlets yet. I'm also going to suggest a weird one here, Culling Deas. This is a little left field, but I found myself very happy with it. It taps to sacrifice, so it's a one-use only sacrifice effect, which wouldn't normally make the cut for most decks that care about sacrificing things. However, in Atla Palani's case, I almost never found that to be an issue. Atla Palani makes eggs at a somewhat slower pace, so the one-off sacrifice effect was usually all that was necessary. Plus, building up a few counters on this card can come in pretty clutch. If you'll forgive the pun, Atla Palani puts all her eggs in one basket, which means a big setback like a board wipe can leave us stranded for a little while. When that happens, even just a small influx of cards can get us back in the game. There are other, more powerful sacrifice outlets out there, but this one has the benefit of being extremely budget-friendly while also matching the tempo of the commander in a very effective way. Finally, inspired by the card Marauding Raptor, there's one more, quote, sack outlet that we absolutely have to get into this deck ASAP, and that's the card Aether Flash. Whenever creatures enter the battlefield, pow! 2 quick damage. Make an egg, instantly crack it to flip some huge lizard or wyvern into play. Best of all, Aether Flash also knocks out nearly every token our opponents might make, dismantling their ability to create a bunch of chump blockers that would stand in the way of our magnificent beasts. That does it for part 2, so now we're moving on to that final and most sunny of sections. Atla Palani loves to look on the bright side, which is fitting because our opponents are going to be left in nothing but shadow when our huge creatures loom over them. Let's take a look at some of these dazzling creatures. To add good monsters, we must also subtract. I've got 3 chops I'm going to end up making here, each tougher than the last. The first is Trostani. With the double pips, casting this card in a 3-color deck is tough, and just like Growing Ranks, the populate effect is just plain slow. I like Trostani in general, I just wasn't enamored with her for this general. Next is Silverclad Ferocidon. As a general beastie, this one's low on the ladder. Nowadays, our enemies have so many treasures or tokens that they can sacrifice that this enrage trigger is downright negligible. It's not a vanilla creature, but it's very close to one, and I think we can chop it to make room for something spicier. Speaking of spicy though, yeah, I'm also just kind of off on Gishath. Gishath is a very powerful commander in its own right, but I just didn't find that its power for Dino Tribal translated to its efficacy in this deck. Our deck does contain other dinosaurs that Gishath could flip into, but it's very, very rare because there are only like 4 of them. Atla Palani is also occasionally played as a dinosaur tribal themed deck, which is great fun and which makes Gishath much more powerful. But when there's just a general smattering of powerful creatures of all different types, Gishath is just kinda left out in the rain. It's got decent power and nice keywords, but so do the other creatures we could be adding in its place. But worst of all, as the deck upgrades and optimizes beyond the average we're seeing here, the number of dinosaurs in the 99 just gets lower and lower. Thus, I think we're better served finding other monsters to use instead of this very expensive one. So yeah, let's get to them. We've got 2 more card slots to fill, and I am auto-slamming Sarah's Emissary into one of them. Y'all, this card's gas. I've been playing it in my Yannette deck, and it has been a house every single time it's hit the battlefield. Protection from creatures means our creatures cannot be blocked, and they cannot die when they do block, which alone would be amazing, but it also means we never need to block because we, the player, also get that protection, meaning any attack against us results in 0 damage. Or if we choose protection from instants, that means that none of the traditional removal spells can come our way. Of the creatures Atla Palani can cheat into play, Sarah's Emissary launched right to the top of the list for cards I just couldn't wait to flip over. Finally, let's give it up for our pal God Eternal Ronus. When it enters the battlefield, it doubles our creature's power. The vigilance ain't too shabby either, but here's the real reason I like it. When Ronus dies, it tucks into our library third from the top. That doesn't sound like much at first, but here's what makes it so good. When it enters, it can double up our creatures, then we sacrifice it and tuck it into the top of the deck. Then we can sacrifice an egg and flip back into the Ronus, doubling up our power again. If we have more eggs, we can repeat this process several times, doubling, quadrupling, octupling our onboard power. Ronus is a bomb in general, but this tricky interaction is just too hilarious to pass up. That's it for our official swaps, but real quick, here are some honorable mentions for a more budget-friendly Atla Palani deck. These are the 4 most expensive cards in the deck, and you'll be perfectly fine without them, and several more besides. Once again, when you're cheating in huge 10/10s, you don't need to have the tip-top very best, because huge creatures can crush our enemies regardless of how much money they cost. Instead of suggesting one-for-one direct swaps for all of these, what I'd like to do is suggest a few strategical directions that could be useful to look into when building with an eye towards budget. First, I definitely think it's worthwhile to look into ways of amplifying Atla Palani's ability, and Battle Mage's Bracers and Instill Energy do just that. Double activations and helpful untapping help us make more than just 1 egg per turn. In addition to this, I'd also recommend looking into other methods of protecting Atla Palani, like with the card Aspect of Mongoose. Atla Palani just draws so much attention to herself, and our enemies know that removing her really hampers our strategy, disrupting the tempo and advantage that our commander is meant to provide. By investing in more sophisticated protection, we'll be able to help make the deck more consistent, which is just a huge boon. Finally, it's important to note that there are some extremely crucial pieces of equipment in this deck. Skullclamp, Greaves, Thornbite Staff, this Naya deck contains a much higher than average number of key equipment cards. Thus, I think Open the Armory is a great way to help us get the protection or enablers or whatever useful tool we need to keep our eggs from being poached. On the flip side, what if you're looking to optimize the deck even further? Here are some other potential upgrades you might want to pursue. I mentioned earlier that as the deck upgrades, we start to lose some dinos. I think the deck quickly outgrows all 3 of these once things begin to tune even more. Marauding Raptor in particular also fits that same mold of kinda not being great to flip off the top of the library. However, I don't think the most optimized versions of this deck are always going to be hungry to find as many big monsters as possible. I think they're actually going to be keen to use cards like Sylvan Library, which help withdraw but also help set up the top of the deck, making sure that Atla Palani always knows what she's flipping into. There's also an Anointed Procession in the list already, which means Parallel Lives is probably not too far behind for the big upgrades. The card I like most, though, is actually Valakut Awakening. If big baddies get stuck in our hand without us yet having the mana to cast them, Awakening can reset our hand, sending those creatures back into the deck for us to hatch later on. That's some sweet tech. And I think that'll do it for us. Atla Palani is ready to unleash some epically cool monsters. You can find the link to the full list below with the cuts in the maybe board. Atla Palani is ecstatic to have enjoyed your company, and if you have any other suggestions that you think your fellow Naya players ought to be playing in their Atla Palani decks too, make sure you leave your ideas in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.